Hello everyone, welcome back. This is the third video in the sound editing series for Korg arrangers, and this is about oscillators. In this video, I'll explain the basics of oscillator configurations and some tricks we can use to create sounds using oscillators. We are in the sound mode now. Let's go to the basic page. Press menu and select basic from the list. This tab is for setting the number of oscillators and some basic settings for the entire sound. In Korg arrangers, oscillators are used to play samples assigned to them. This sound has 8 oscillators in it. We can set up to 24 oscillators in a sound. If we go to the oscillator tab, we can configure the settings for each oscillator individually. We can select each oscillator from here. Each oscillator has 1 or 2 samples assigned to them. The sample assigned in the high section is played by default. There is a setting which activates a lower sample. I'll come back to it in a few minutes. When there are multiple oscillators in a sound, it doesn't always mean that all the oscillators are played at the same time when we play the sound. Each oscillator can be set to play on different trigger events while playing. For example, this sound has 8 oscillators and they are set to play on different velocity ranges. Another option is to set it to play on different key ranges so that we can have many split points on the keyboard than the normal left and right split point. You can set different EQ settings for each oscillator here. I am setting the oscillator count to 2 for now. I am resetting the velocity ranges. There is a setting called scaled velocity. This is useful when we use multiple velocity ranges in different oscillators. Just to give an example, when we have a velocity range for an oscillator as 1 to 80, the oscillator will play when velocity is within this range. So the maximum volume level this oscillator can produce is 80. The scaled velocity is used to solve this problem. It sets the actual velocity ranges used for the volume levels for that oscillator. When the velocity range is 1 to 80 and the scaled velocity range is 1 to 127, it means that the actual keyboard velocity of 80 is equal to 127. So at a velocity of 80, the volume level would be 127. Here when I change the velocity range to 1 to 127, the scaled velocity is 116 to 127. It means that at velocity 1, the volume level would be 116 and at 127, it would be 127. So this oscillator would sound like the velocity sensitivity is deactivated. I'm changing it to 1. We can assign the samples to the oscillator here. It is a multi-sample which we assign to the oscillator. There is another type of sample which is drum sample. It is assigned to each key when creating a drum kit. Multi-sample is a collection of samples split across different key ranges. I'll cover it in detail in another video. When we assign samples to an oscillator, it would be normally in the high section. The low section will not play unless it is enabled. We can solo the oscillator from here so that only the selected oscillator will be played. This is the first oscillator. This is the second one. Let me change the sample of this oscillator. This is how it sounds. This option is to reverse the sample playback. It is reversed now. Now it is back to normal. This is offset position. There may be offset positions assigned in multi-samples. It is a point after the starting position of the sample. So the sample will play from the selected offset position instead of the starting position. If there are offset positions set in the samples, it will be available here. The number of offset positions would be different on each sample. Let us try changing the offset points. If you select pseudo random, it will choose a random offset point every time you press a key. AMS is to assign an alternate modulation source for setting the offset position while playing. We can set it here. Set the intensity value in this section. The modulation source is velocity now. Based on the velocity applied, the offset point would be different. Let me change it to joystick Y+. This is applied when we move the joystick forward. Now the offset point is 0 when the joystick is not used. When we move it forward, the offset point will change based on the joystick value. Now I'll show you how to assign samples to an oscillator with the low and high sections. These two cannot be played at the same time. It needs a velocity switch position assigned to the oscillator to play both the sounds. Once it is set, when the velocity is below the switch value, the lower sample will be played. At a higher velocity, the higher sample will be played. By default, the velocity switch value will be 1, which means it will always play the higher sample. That is the reason why the lower sample is not heard, even if you assign a sample in it. I will assign 2 samples now. Now it plays only the higher one. I am setting the velocity switch to 100. Now the higher sample will be played only when the velocity is higher than 99. At lower velocity values, the lower one will be played. This is how to use 2 samples in the same oscillator. We can create the same effect with 2 oscillators as well. I am changing the velocity switch value to 1. Now assigning the flute flutter sample to the second oscillator. We are not using the lower sample in this case for both the oscillators. Assigning the normal flute sample in the oscillator 1. Here we are going to set the oscillator 1 to play at lower velocities and the second one at higher velocities. We can set it in the velocity range tab. This is for oscillator 2. And this is for the first one. I had soloed the oscillator earlier, removing that. Now at a higher velocity, oscillator 2 is played, and at lower velocity, oscillator 1 is played. There is an issue with the volume in the second oscillator. The scaled velocity is set to 1 here. The velocity range is 100 to 127 for this oscillator. But the actual velocity range used for the volume would be 1 to 127. So it would be 1 when the actual velocity is 100 and 127 when it is 127. I will set the minimum to 100 so that the sound's volume is okay. I am changing it to a guitar sound. Now in the second oscillator, it is a guitar slide sample. It is set to play at a velocity higher than 99. This is how it plays. Now there is another option to trigger this oscillator with a slide sound. We can assign it to one of the assignable buttons. It is called the sound controller. So when the assignable button is pressed, the oscillator will be played. I'm resetting the velocity ranges. We don't need them now. When I play, it is the first oscillator which is played. But when the assignable button is pressed, it plays the second oscillator. The assignable switch has two modes. By default, it is in booking mode. It means when the switch is pressed, it will be activated, and after the first key press, it will be deactivated. There is another mode called toggle. In this mode, the button will be activated when pressed, and it will be active until you press it again. Now it is toggle. Once it is activated, the second oscillator plays on each key press. There is one more setting for this. Now when the assignable switch is active, both the oscillators are playing. We want the first one to play only when the assignable switch is inactive. This checkbox is for that. Now when the button is active, the first oscillator is muted. I am assigning it to joystick Y+. Now instead of the assignable switch, it will be triggered when the joystick is pushed forward. Like this, you can assign different trigger events for each oscillator. I'll show you another technique now. Assigning some bell sounds. There is a delay setting. I am setting it for the second oscillator. This will delay the triggering of the oscillator. This gives a dual effect. This sound doesn't have a sustain now. We can go to the main screen and increase the release for that. It will add some sustain to this. Let me change the octave of this oscillator. Now another option. Assigning some different samples. There is another trigger mode called cycle. I am assigning cycle 1 to both the oscillators. This will play the oscillators in a sequence on each key press. When I press a key first, the first oscillator plays. On the second key press, the second one plays. On the third key press, it starts from the first oscillator again. Let me add some more oscillators. Assigning samples to 3 and 4. And setting all of them to play on cycle 1. The previous velocity settings are there for these oscillators. Resetting them. Now the 4 oscillators are playing in a sequence. There is a cycle 2 which can be used to play in parallel to the cycle 1 if you need. I'll show you one more option with the oscillators. Setting the oscillator count to 2. I'm changing the samples. Now the first one has a piano sound. The second one has a string sound. I'm assigning the trigger mode for the second oscillator to note off. This will trigger the oscillator when the key is released, but this will keep the note sustained. For fixing this, we need to adjust the amp envelope settings. Envelopes control the lifetime of a property. I'll cover the envelopes in detail in another video. For now, I'll adjust some parameters from it. Now the sound is getting faded out after a small delay. I'm changing it to a piano sample. Now when the key is pressed, oscillator 1 is played. And when the key is released, oscillator 2 is played. Changing it back to strings. Now assigning joystick Y+. This will trigger it when the joystick is moved forward. So this is the oscillator and some tricks which you can do using oscillators. That's it for this video. I'll create more videos on the other settings in the sound mode soon. So see you in the next one. Thank you.